Never, under any circumstances, take the graveyard shift at an isolated gas station, because what happened to me 3 years ago on Route 9 in rural Pennsylvania didn't just ruin my life. It permanently broke my sanity and made me realize that some monsters don't wait for the dark. They live inside it, watching you through the glass until you're completely alone. My name is Logan, and back when I was a 19-year-old college kid looking for some quick, easy cash to pay for my tuition, taking the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift at a rundown, middle-of-nowhere Shell station seemed like the perfect gig since I figured I could just sit around, play video games on my phone, and study in absolute peace. The night started out completely normal with the cold November wind howling outside, rattling the rusty metal frame of the building, while the cheap, buzzing fluorescent lights overhead flickered rhythmically, casting long, jittery shadows across the rows of dusty snack aisles and plastic soda coolers. Around 1:15 a.m., a sudden, heavy silence fell over the entire area, so intense that the loud humming of the beverage refrigerators completely stopped, leaving me in a vacuum of dead air where the only sound was the frantic, rapid thumping of my own heartbeat. I looked up from my textbook, feeling a sudden, icy chill crawl directly down my spine as the digital clock on the wall began to glitch, the numbers spinning backward wildly before freezing entirely on 3:33 a.m. Right at that exact second, a horrific wet scratching sound echoed from the dark corner of the store near the storage room, sounding exactly like long, human fingernails tearing violently into the drywall. I froze completely, my breath catching in my dry throat as I strained my eyes to see through the dim aisles. But the shadows seemed to stretch and grow taller, shifting on their own against the walls like living entities. I tried to shake off the panic, telling myself it was just a stray rat or a raccoon trapped in the walls, but then the automated driveway bell chimed loudly, a sharp ding that made me jump straight out of my black plastic chair. I looked out the massive front glass windows and saw a rusted, pitch-black sedan pull up to pump number 4, its headlights completely turned off and its engine idling with a deep, guttural, unnatural purr that literally caused the metal shelves inside the store to vibrate violently. No one got out of the vehicle for several long minutes, and the windows were tinted so darkly that it was completely impossible to see who or what was sitting in the driver's seat. Suddenly, the driver's side door clicked open with a loud, metallic snap, and an incredibly foul, overpowering stench of decaying meat and wet dirt instantly drifted through the building's air vents, making me gag and cover my nose in absolute disgust. I blinked, expecting to see a normal customer step out, but instead, the empty car door just swung wide open in the wind, and when I raised my eyes back to the front window, my blood turned to absolute ice. A tall, impossibly thin man was now standing right outside the glass, mere inches away from me, his pale, gray face pressed flat against the window pane, leaving a thick, greasy smear of dark blood on the glass surface. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely devoid of pupils, staring directly into my soul with an unblinking, psychotic gaze, while his jaw hung open at a horrific, unnatural angle that looked like it had been violently broken and shattered. My body went completely numb with terror as I backed away toward the old cash register, my hands shaking so uncontrollably that I dropped my cell phone on the linoleum floor, shattering the screen into a web of cracks. I frantically grabbed the old plastic landline phone to dial 911, but the moment I lifted the receiver to my ear, there was no dial tone, only the agonizing sound of wet, heavy, synchronized breathing on the other end, followed by a raspy, metallic voice whispering my exact home address and my mother's name over and over again. Before I could even scream, every single light inside the store violently exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging me into pitch-black darkness, save for the eerie, pulsating red glow of the cash register's malfunction screen. Then a sharp, deafening sound of metal scraping against the front glass doors echoed through the dark, a slow, deliberate clawing that cut deep, visible gouges into the thick glass, cracking it right down the center. Total, blind panic took over my mind, and I scrambled backward into the small employee break room, slamming the heavy wooden door shut and locking it with a deadbolt just as the front glass of the convenience store shattered completely with a loud, explosive crash. Through the tiny 2-inch gap beneath the break room door, I watched in absolute horror as a dark, twisted shadow stretched across the floorboards outside, moving with a bizarre, jerky, spider-like motion that defied human anatomy. The wet, heavy footsteps followed right behind, accompanied by the sickening sound of bones cracking and popping with every single movement the entity made. The scratching sound didn't stop at the door. Instead, it suddenly moved with impossible speed up the walls and directly onto the ceiling right above my head, with heavy, loud thuds vibrating through the thin ceiling tiles. Dust, old insulation, and dead insects rained down onto my terrified face as I squeezed my eyes shut, holding my breath so hard my lungs burned, praying for the morning sun to rise and save me. But then, the worst possible thing happened as the metal handle of the break room door began to slowly, smoothly turn clockwise, clicking loudly in the dead silence of the night. The old wooden door frame started to groan and splinter under an immense, supernatural pressure from the outside, making me realize the lock was going to give away in a matter of seconds. Frantic, I looked around the pitch-black room, my hands scraping against the walls until I grabbed a heavy, rusty iron crowbar from the top of a maintenance shelf just as the door frame cracked open with a deafening, splintering boom. Standing in the broken doorway was the entity from the pump, but its arms had now stretched unnaturally long, hanging down past its knees, and its fingers ended in sharp, blackened, jagged claws that dripped with a dark, viscous fluid. It didn't walk toward me. It glided across the floor with blinding speed, its broken jaw snapping shut and opening rapidly with a horrific, bone-crushing sound that echoed off the concrete walls. I let out a primal scream and swung the iron crowbar with every ounce of strength left in my body, striking the creature directly in the side of its pale neck, but the impact felt like hitting a solid wall of concrete, sending a painful shockwave straight up my arms. The entity didn't bleed, it didn't cry out, and it didn't even flinch. Instead, it slowly turned its head a full 180 degrees to face me, a sickening grin spreading across its mangled face. It grabbed my bare forearm with a grip so intensely cold it felt like liquid nitrogen, burning my skin instantly, turning it a bruised purple and forcing me to drop the crowbar as I shrieked in absolute, unbearable agony. It pulled me closer, its breath smelling of iron, copper, and rotting graves, its hollow, dead eyes boring into mine as its jaw unhinged completely, revealing rows of needle-like, yellow teeth ready to tear my throat out. Just as I accepted my death, the loud, piercing, beautiful sound of a police siren echoed from the main highway outside, throwing brilliant, blinding flashes of blue and red light through the shattered windows of the store. The creature instantly let out a high-pitched, deafening, unearthly shriek that made my ears bleed, dropping me heavily onto the floor before sprinting backward on all fours up the wall and disappearing straight through a massive hole in the ceiling tiles. When the state trooper finally entered the store with his gun drawn, he found me curled into a tight fetal position in the corner of the destroyed break room, sobbing uncontrollably, clutching my severely burned arm and pointing wildly at the dark ceiling. The police searched the dense woods behind the gas station for 3 consecutive days with tracking dogs, but they found absolutely nothing except for a continuous trail of black, foul-smelling fluid that suddenly dead-ended at the edge of an old, boarded-up colonial well. To this very day, the local authorities have no logical explanation for the strange chemical burns on my arm, the destroyed store, or the security footage that showed me physically fighting a dark, blurry anomaly that didn't possess a human reflection or silhouette. I quit that job the exact same morning, and I refuse to ever drive down Route 9 or stop at a gas station after the sun goes down, because deep down in my soul, I know that whatever entity was watching me from that black sedan is still out there, hiding in the dark corners of an empty pump, patiently waiting for the next lone night shift worker to step outside into the shadows. If you ever get offered a job as a night auditor at an old, secluded hotel, I am begging you to turn it down immediately and walk away, because there are things trapped inside those long, empty corridors that feed on human isolation, waiting for the entire world to go to sleep so they can trap you in a waking nightmare you will never escape. My name is Tyler, and 2 years ago, I took the midnight to 8 a.m. shift at the Whispering Pines Resort, a fading, historic 5-story hotel nestled deep in the dark woods of upstate New York, completely ignoring the unsettling rumors about the third floor being permanently closed off to the public due to a horrific tragedy that the management desperately tried to cover up decades ago. The job paid twice the minimum wage, which seemed like a blessing for a broke college student. And for the first few weeks, the shift was incredibly boring, consisting only of filing paperwork, checking in the occasional late-night truck driver, and drinking stale coffee while staring at the bank of black and white security monitors behind the front desk. However, everything changed on a freezing, stormy Tuesday night in December around 3 in the morning, when a sudden, heavy pressure dropped over the entire lobby, causing the air to turn so bitterly cold that my breath immediately formed thick, white clouds in front of my face. The bright fluorescent lights overhead began to buzz violently and hum with an aggressive, electrical frequency before dimming to a sickly, pale yellow, casting long, distorted shadows across the antique furniture. I sat up straight, my skin tingling with an overwhelming, primitive sensation of being watched. And when I glanced at the main security monitor, my heart skipped a beat because the video feed for the closed third floor was completely filled with thick static, but through the gray haze, I could clearly see the silhouette of a tall, unnaturally thin figure standing perfectly still right in front of the lens. I blinked hard, thinking it was just a glitch in the old equipment, but then the heavy brass elevator bell chimed loudly across the empty lobby, a sharp, echoing sound that shattered the silence like a gunshot. I watched in absolute paralysis as the rusted elevator doors slowly ground open on their own, revealing a completely empty, dark metal car that smelled overwhelmingly of stagnant river water and rotting wood. Before I could even step out from behind the counter to investigate, the heavy, rotary house phone on my desk began to ring with a piercing, deafening clang that made me jump out of my chair in pure terror. I picked up the receiver with a trembling hand, whispering a shaky greeting into the speaker. But there was no human voice on the other end, only the agonizing, wet sound of someone choking on liquid, accompanied by a rhythmic, rapid splashing sound, as if someone was violently thrashing around in a deep pool of water. I slammed the phone back on the cradle, gasping for air as a wave of nausea hit me. But the exact second the plastic hit the base, the digital caller ID flashed with red text that read room 314, which was a room on the sealed third floor that hadn't been occupied since 1984. Knowing that a trespasser or a dangerous vagrant must have broken into the restricted area, I realized I had no choice but to grab my heavy metal flashlight and the master security key card to go up there and check the floor myself. The moment I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the third floor, the metal doors slammed shut with a violent force, and the elevator began to ascend with a sickening, jerking motion that made the cable scream. Halfway up, the interior light bulb exploded overhead, plunging me into absolute pitch darkness while a loud, frantic scratching sound began to tear at the metal roof of the elevator car, as if something with sharp iron claws was desperately trying to dig its way inside to get to me. I let out a terrified scream, frantically hitting the emergency open button until the elevator finally ground to a halt and the doors slid open onto the forbidden third floor, releasing a wave of air so intensely foul and freezing that it immediately burned my throat. I clicked on my flashlight, its weak beam cutting through a thick, unnatural fog that rolled down the long corridor, illuminating peeling, water-damaged wallpaper that seemed to actively pulse and contract like the interior of a living organ. Every single step I took down that hallway felt like walking through thick mud, the silence so heavy that the loud snapping of my boots on the damp carpet sounded like breaking bones. As I passed room 310, a pale, bloated human hand suddenly slammed violently against the inside of the door's glass peephole, making me scream and drop my flashlight as the sound of desperate, muffled weeping echoed from within the locked room. I scrambled to pick up the light, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold it. And when I shined the beam back at the door, the hand was gone, leaving behind a thick smear of dark, black slime that was slowly sliding down the wood. I forced myself to keep moving toward room 314, my instinct screaming at me to run back to the elevator, but an unnatural, hypnotic force seemed to pull my feet forward against my own will. When I finally reached the door of room 314, I noticed a massive, dark puddle of water rapidly seeping out from beneath the door frame, staining the hallway carpet with a dark, reddish-brown fluid that carried the undeniable, metallic stench of fresh blood. I raised my hand to knock, but before my knuckles could even touch the wood, the electronic lock on the door suddenly chirped from red to green on its own, and the heavy door smoothly swung wide open into a pitch-black room. The temperature inside the room was so unnaturally low that ice crystals were actively forming on the walls and through the shadows. I could hear the distinct, terrifying sound of heavy footsteps walking through water, moving directly toward the doorway. I raised my flashlight, and the beam illuminated a figure standing in the center of the flooded room. A woman wearing a soaked, tattered nightgown, her long, tangled black hair completely obscuring her face, her body shivering with a violent, unnatural tremor. I froze, my voice completely trapped in my throat, as she slowly, deliberately lifted her head, and my brain struggled to comprehend the horror of what I was looking at, because she had absolutely no eyes, just two deep, hollow, bleeding sockets that leaked a thick, black fluid down her pale, decaying cheeks. She stretched her mouth open into a wide, impossible yawn that completely tore the skin at the corners of her lips, and she let out a deafening, high-pitched, unearthly shriek that instantly shattered my flashlight lens and blew out every remaining emergency light in the corridor, plunging the entire floor into an absolute, suffocating darkness. I dropped the broken flashlight and fell to my knees, sobbing in pure terror as the wet, heavy squelching of her footsteps accelerated into a terrifying sprint, rushing directly toward me out of the room. I tried to scramble backward on my hands and knees in the dark, but two freezing wet hands with razor-sharp fingernails violently grabbed my ankles, digging deep into my skin and dragging me backward across the wet carpet into the darkness of room 314. I screamed in absolute agony, kicking wildly with my free leg until my heavy boot connected with something soft and wet, causing the entity to let out a guttural, angry hiss and momentarily release its death grip on my legs. I didn't waste a single millisecond. I threw myself forward, scrambling to my feet and sprinting down the pitch-black hallway by memory alone, while the sound of the creature crawling rapidly along the walls and the ceiling right above my head followed me like a giant hunting insect. Cold, foul-smelling water dripped onto my face from the ceiling tiles as the entity kept pace with me, its long claws snapping and clicking against the light fixtures just inches from my ears. I reached the emergency stairwell door and threw my entire body weight against the heavy metal bar, tumbling headfirst down the concrete steps and landing hard on the second-floor landing, severely spraining my wrist and bruising my ribs. I scrambled back to my feet, ignoring the agonizing pain, and bolted down the remaining stairs until I burst back into the bright, warm lobby, where I immediately ran into the security office, slammed the heavy deadbolt shut, and collapsed against the door, hyperventilating and weeping hysterically. I frantically looked up at the security monitors to see if the entity had followed me down, and what I saw on the screen will haunt me until the day I die, because the monitor for the lobby showed the hallway outside my office door completely empty, but the monitor for the third floor showed the eyeless, pale woman standing inches away from the security camera lens, her face twisted into a wide, psychotic grin, while her long, bloody finger pointed directly at the camera and a raspy, distorted whisper began to emit from the office intercom speakers, softly calling out my name. I stayed locked in that room for 3 agonizing hours until the morning shift manager arrived at 7 a.m. And when he opened the door, he found me curled into a ball in the corner, clutching a pair of heavy scissors, completely out of my mind with fear. The hotel management immediately fired me that afternoon, and threatened to sue me if I ever spoke a word to anyone about what happened, claiming that the water damage and broken lights were just an old plumbing issue. But I later discovered through old newspaper archives that in 1984, a young woman had been brutally drowned in the bathtub of room 314 by a hotel employee, and her body wasn't found until weeks later when the stagnant water began to leak through the lobby ceiling. I never went back to the Whispering Pines Resort, and to this day, I can never sleep in a hotel room without keeping all the lights on and placing heavy towels tightly under the door frame. Because every time I hear the faint sound of dripping water in the quiet of the night, I am paralyzed by the absolute certainty that she has finally found me, and that the door lock is about to click from red to green on its own. If you ever think about signing up for a graveyard security shift at an old, isolated industrial warehouse just to get some easy money, I am warning you with every single ounce of my being to rip up that application immediately and never look back. Because what happened to me during a torrential storm in the winter of 2021 changed me from a normal, confident 24-year-old man into a paranoid, trembling wreck who cannot even sit in a dark room without checking the corners every 5 seconds. My name is Marcus, and I had just accepted a high-paying midnight to 8 a.m. security position at a massive, automated logistics facility stretching across several acres of desolate land in rural Ohio, a place filled with endless rows of towering 30-foot steel shelves that cast long, labyrinthine shadows under the dim, buzzing motion-activated safety lights overhead. The entire complex was a maze of wooden crates, heavy machinery, and industrial equipment. And since 90% of the building was entirely automated at night, my only job was to sit inside a small, glass-walled security booth at the main entrance, monitor a bank of 16 high-definition security cameras, and conduct 2 manual walking patrols of the entire perimeter to ensure no local teenagers or thieves broke in. The first 3 hours of my shift were completely uneventful, filled only with the rhythmic, deafening sound of rain slamming against the corrugated metal roof high above my head and the low, mechanical humming of the facility's main electrical generators. However, the exact moment the clock on my monitor ticked over to 3:14 a.m., a sudden, suffocating wave of dread washed over me, so intense that the hairs on my arms stood completely on end, and a metallic taste of pure adrenaline flooded my mouth. I watched in absolute confusion as the motion sensor alarms for Sector 4, the oldest, deepest, and most poorly lit section of the warehouse, were broken. Historical manufacturing equipment was stored, began to trip one after another in a perfect, rapid, straight line, as if something was sprinting at an impossible speed through the darkness. I locked my eyes onto Camera 7, which covered the main corridor of Sector 4, and my breath caught in my throat as the clean digital screen violently glitched, filling with thick, gray horizontal lines of static before revealing a terrifying silhouette standing perfectly still in the dead center of the aisle. The entity was easily over 7 feet tall, its body impossibly emaciated and skeletal, covered in a tight, translucent gray skin that looked wet, and its head was tilted at a horrific 90-degree angle, resting completely flat against its own right shoulder, as if its neck had been violently snapped. It stood there in the flickering light for 3 agonizing seconds, and then, with a slow, jerky motion that looked like a broken puppet, it raised a long, unhealthily extended arm and pointed a single, jagged finger directly at the camera lens, proving without a shadow of a doubt that it knew I was watching it from the security booth. Before I could even process what I was looking at, the camera feed completely blacked out, replaced by a flashing red message that read "Signal lost," and a second later, cameras 8, 9, and 10 simultaneously died in a cascade of static. Company policy strictly dictated that I had to manually investigate any sensor trips or hardware failures before calling the local police. So with my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped animal, I grabbed my heavy-duty metal maglite flashlight, unclipped my tactical baton, and stepped out of the warm security booth into the vast, freezing, and echoing darkness of the main warehouse floor. The moment the security booth door clicked shut behind me, the air inside the warehouse felt completely different. It was freezing cold, smelling heavily of ancient rust, wet copper, and a foul, suffocating odor of ozone that made it incredibly difficult to draw a full breath without coughing. I clicked on my flashlight, its bright white beam cutting a fragile hole through the pitch-black darkness, illuminating the towering shelves that now looked like giant ribs of a decayed beast closing in around me. As I approached the threshold of Sector 4, the heavy drumming of the rain on the roof seemed to fade away, replaced by an artificial, heavy silence that was suddenly shattered by the distinct, metallic clanging sound of a heavy iron chain being violently dragged across the concrete floor in the very next aisle. Security, is anyone there? This is private property. Show yourself right now, or I will release the alarm. I shouted into the dark, but my voice just bounced pathetically off the steel beams, sounding weak, hollow, and utterly terrified. The dragging sound instantly stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing, until a wet, heavy, rhythmic panting echoed from directly behind my back, close enough that I could feel a freezing blast of air hit the nape of my neck. I spun around with a terrified shriek, swinging my flashlight and baton wildly through the empty air, but there was absolutely nothing there, only the long, shifting shadows of the wooden pallets stretching into the darkness. I began to back away slowly, my boots clicking loudly on the concrete. But before I could take 3 steps, a massive 200-pound wooden crate was violently hurled from the top shelf of aisle 12, smashing into thousands of wooden splinters right in front of my face with a deafening, explosive boom that sent debris flying into my eyes. I stumbled backward, falling hard onto the cold floor, and when I frantically pointed my flashlight beam upward toward the top of the 30-foot steel racks, my brain screamed in absolute horror at what I saw. The gray, emaciated creature was crawling along the underside of the steel roof beams like a massive, overgrown spider, its impossibly long limbs bending backward at unnatural angles, its fingers ending in sharp, blackened claws that dug deep into the solid metal with a sickening screeching sound. Its face was now fully illuminated by my light, revealing that it had no nose or lips, just 2 glowing, hollow yellow eyes that burned with a psychotic, predatory intelligence, and a massive, unhinged jaw filled with rows of needle-like yellow teeth that were dripping with a thick, black, viscous fluid. It let out a low, vibrating, sub-bass growl that literally shook the concrete floor beneath my body, and then it leaped directly down from the 30-foot height, landing heavily on all fours with a loud, bone-shattering thud just 10 feet away from me. Blind panic took complete control of my mind, and I scrambled to my feet, dropping my baton and sprinting down the main aisle as fast as my legs could physically carry me, while the creature pursued me with terrifying speed, its heavy, rapid footsteps and clicking claws echoing right behind my back like a runaway freight train. I sprinted toward the nearest emergency fire exit, my lungs burning and tears of pure terror blurring my vision. But when I threw my entire weight against the heavy metal push bar, the door didn't budge an inch, its electronic maglocks completely frozen shut due to the storm outside, trapping me inside the dark facility with the anomaly. I looked back and saw the creature glided around the corner of the aisle, its long arms reaching out to grab me. So I dove into a narrow, reinforced concrete electrical closet to my left, slamming the heavy steel door shut and throwing the manual deadbolt into place just a millisecond before the creature slammed its entire body mass against the outside of the door with the force of a speeding vehicle. The thick steel door dented inward violently, the metal hinges groaning under the immense supernatural pressure, throwing me off balance and sending me crashing into the electrical panels behind me. I pressed my back flat against the wall, hyperventilating in the pitch darkness of the small room, holding my hands over my mouth to muffle my hysterical sobbing as the creature began to violently scrape its razor-sharp claws against the exterior of the door, producing a high-pitched, ear-splitting screech that made my ears bleed. Then, the scratching abruptly stopped, and a terrifying, dead silence filled the closet for several long minutes, until a voice began to softly emit from the small ventilation grate near the top of the door, a voice that was a perfect, flawless, yet horribly distorted and mechanical copy of my own voice, whispering my name, mocking my terror, and telling me that there was no way out of the darkness. I pulled out my security walkie-talkie with a trembling hand, desperately pressing the button to scream for emergency assistance from the main monitoring station. But the speaker only emitted a deafening burst of static followed by the sound of a woman crying hysterically and a deep, raspy voice laughing in a slow, rhythmic cadence that chilled me to the absolute bone. Suddenly, the creature began to violently beat against the door again. But this time, it was targeting the heavy metal hinges, and with a sickening pop, the top hinge snapped completely, causing the door to lean inward, revealing a 2-inch gap of pure darkness. Through that narrow gap, I watched in absolute paralysis as a long, skeletal gray hand with jagged black claws slowly slid inside the room, feeling around the frame, trying to reach the manual deadbolt from the inside to unlock it. I knew that if that door opened, I would be brutally torn to pieces, so I raised my heavy metal mag-light flashlight with both hands and began to smash it down onto the creature's hand with every single ounce of strength I had left, striking the gray flesh repeatedly until the metal of my flashlight was dented and covered in a cold, foul-smelling black slime. The entity let out a high-pitched, unearthly, and deafening shriek that completely shattered the glass bulb of my flashlight, plunging me into a total, absolute darkness where I could see nothing, but I could hear the door frame splintering further as the creature threw its weight against the compromised barrier one final time. I closed my eyes, curled into a tight ball on the floor, and began to pray for a swift death as the steel door was completely ripped off its remaining hinges with a horrific tearing sound, exposing me entirely to the entity. But just as I felt a freezing, wet hand wrap around my ankle with a grip that felt like solid ice, the loud, piercing horn of the morning delivery trucks echoed from the loading docks outside, accompanied by the bright, artificial floodlights of the warehouse turning back on as the main power grid reset. The creature instantly let out a frustrated, gurgling hiss, releasing its grip on my leg, and when I opened my eyes, I caught a brief glimpse of its massive, spider-like silhouette sprinting up the wall and vanishing into the deep, unlit shadows of the high-ceiling rafters. At 6 a.m., the morning shift supervisor found me locked inside the ruined electrical closet, clutching a broken flashlight like a weapon, screaming hysterically, and refusing to let anyone touch me until the police arrived. The corporate office immediately confiscated all the hard drives containing the security footage from that night, claiming there was a massive electrical fire that destroyed the cameras, and they fired me the very next afternoon for property damage, offering me a massive severance package on the strict condition that I sign a non-disclosure agreement promising never to speak about what happened in Sector 4. I later did some digging into the history of the land and discovered that in the late 1970s, 3 maintenance workers had been accidentally sealed alive inside a hidden underground storage vault during a massive renovation of the old plant, and their bodies were never recovered from the deep foundations. I never went back to the security industry, and to this day, I refuse to ever enter a large warehouse, a big box store, or any facility with high ceilings after the sun goes down, because every time I see a flickering light or a shadow moving high up in the steel rafters, my blood turns to absolute ice, and I'm paralyzed by the terrifying knowledge that the guardian of Sector 4 is still up there in the dark, crawling along the beams, patiently waiting for the lights to go out again.